So we talked about a lot of stuff, but I've been trying to anticipate what kind of questions people are going to have, about me growing up, with an opportunity for us to chat about it. And so one thing that I thought we've skimmed or talked a little bit about various things, but we haven't really dived into this, and I have been asked about it before, and that is what's it like being raised in a Scientology family, right? Like what did I do, right? We talked about what your life was, getting involved in Scientology, working at the mission, you and Dad working there and that sort of thing. But what was your effort in raising me as a Scientologist? Because by the time I was 3 or 4, you were full-blown Scientologist, right?
That's true.
So what was your effort as a parent with me in using Scientology?
That's interesting, because I'm going to back it up a little bit. I had already made choices and decisions about how I wanted to be as a parent and what I did and didn't want to have happen in your life. Some of that involved religion, because I had been raised Catholic, and in the Catholic Church, you're indoctrinated by baptism when you're too young to know what was going on. It seemed like another bath to me. And I was fully raised in the Catholic Church. I went to Catholic grade school, high school, nursing school. I was indoctrinated into the Catholic Church.
Catholic wedding.
Yeah.
Because Dad was not Catholic.
He did not want anything to do with a Catholic wedding. And that was, talk about somebody really, doing something because they had to. My grandmother told me that she wouldn't come to my wedding if I didn't get married in the church. And my mom made it very clear to me that as the oldest of 9 kids, I was setting an example, and if the example I was setting was not getting married in the church, they weren't going to be happy with that at all. So I was under just a tad of pressure to do it. And it wasn't just walking into the church and getting married. We had to do a pre-marriage, I think they called them pre-Cana conferences or something, pre-marriage conferences, where you met with a priest who has never been married, who is now going to be the authority over what he's going to tell you that marriage is all about. And poor Larry and I are sitting there going, okay. And what I learned was marriage was going to be a series of compromises, which actually
was true.
It ended up being. But I was firmly not going to let that happen to my kids. My kids were going to have the freedom of choice. I wanted them to learn about, I really would have liked to have seen you guys do a comparative religion course somewhere along the line so that you would know what you were choosing one way or another, but that nobody had the right to make you into something that you didn't even have a choice about. So I felt the same way about Scientology. It wasn't any different for me with that. If there were good things about it that I could help, our lives with, I was interested in knowing what that was, and I was also interested in you guys being aware of some of the good stuff. Beyond that, I had no axe to grind about what you did or didn't do until you were a teenager and you decided that you were going to, jump the gun and do it when you were 17 and join staff.
Yeah. But I'd already gotten involved fully with Scientology at that
before
point.
That. So, from the time that, you were probably 2 or 3 years old, I was aware of some of the things that Scientology taught, and I tried to apply that in my life. That was the whole thing about Scientology. If it was true for you, it was true because you could use it. You could benefit from it. So I was willing to apply any of that. And little things that I remember, like touch assists, And for people that don't know, a touch assist is just a small little assist that you do by touching people's body in different places. And say if you have a pain in your knee or whatever, you just follow the procedure for a touch assist, and it's supposed to make it better.
Right.
And actually, it did it a lot. anytime somebody pays attention to you when you don't feel good or you have an owie, I mean, it works.
I mean, that is probably more therapeutic than the feel my finger, because I'll tell you, as the years went on, and especially when I was on staff and in the Sea Org, just a hate assist.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my
there
God.
were things that were just crazy.
They were ridiculous.
I know. But there were things that you can make workable, especially with a little kid. So that kind of stuff, misunderstood words, it still makes sense to me. Totally. That's totally, you know.
The idea being that if you're reading something or studying something and there's words in the material that you don't understand or slightly misunderstand in some way, it will impede your ability to understand the overall text. And that's fairly common sense. Actually, the people who came up with that were a couple teachers who were Scientologists, not L. Ron Hubbard.
Right. So as you learn more through Scientology and then about Scientology afterwards, coming in the back door, you find out why some of these things work.
That's right. That's right. Because what's the problem with Scientology is they'll take that one principle, which is a workable principle, and they exaggerate its importance beyond all comprehension so that it's the only thing that matters in study, pretty much. And that's, they have some other things that they talk about, but really it's all about the misunderstood word, and that's exaggerated.
Right. Communication, of course, for me and your dad benefited all of us. And I don't remember. Did we sit down and do DTRS with you when you were older? Not when you were little, though.
No, because we did them with Jason and I, my brother, right?
Did I make you sit across from each other and look at each other? Really?
No, Dad did. Yes. Yeah, we would drill those sometimes. I remember that when I was in high school in Santa Maria.
That's not a bad idea.
I guess
You didn't know what was going on. That was the bad part of it.
I mean, yeah, because there's a certain degree of it's not like we were doing it for this reason, but there's some strange, you do it for an extended period of time, you can get in some pretty altered states.
Yeah, that's true. That's
we didn't do it for anything like that. We were doing it like 10 minutes at a time to try to make Jason and I, be in better communication. Can you at least sit down and look at each other? Sort of
I have
thing.
to tell you something. The other day I saw this thing on YouTube or wherever it was, and it was some mother's choice to do that. She had maybe a 6-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, and they had to both fit their head through their dad's T-shirt and wear one T-shirt. And they had to walk around the house like that till they would get together. I thought that's genius.
That would have been a better
made
than
as much
sitting,
sense
that's
as
right,
TRs.
as TRs. That's right.
Funny. Anyway.
I'll just relate a couple things here, in terms of some of the things I remember growing up. As I remember doing when I was very young, I'm talking, 5, 7 years old. I remember doing a communications course. And I don't know that they had a children's communication course particularly back then.
But I remember designed for kids.
I remember doing the TRs. I remember yelling at the ashtray. Up in some room at the Pasadena mission, they had some room set up for it where you could just yell and yell and yell.
Well, tell them what. I mean, that was.
But I didn't have any context for it.
Right. So all you were doing
was
all
I was doing was
ashtray.
doing what I was told to do, and I was kind of like, okay, like it really made no sense.
Oh.
And and then of course growing up in Scientology with you guys being on staff, I hung around the mission all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember falling asleep there at night and, you guys carrying me home and hanging out there on the weekends and stuff. There was this room where me and another kid would play and hang out because we just didn't have anything else to do and didn't have anywhere else to go,
Yeah.
So, and sometimes, wandering around the mission and just getting into trouble and giving people, hi, what's going on in here?
And, I think that was early on when we were on staff in the mission because eventually there was a thing that came down that said no kids allowed.
Right. Right. I'm probably part of the reason for that.
No, I think it was just we came into our own, and we knew that was not an appropriate place for kids for one, and it was distracting from what they were trying to do at the mission.
Right.
But when we were young and we had little kids and stuff, we did a lot of things.
Yeah, exactly. But it also made Scientology the normal thing for me. as a kid, growing up, all our friends were Scientologists, right? They'd come over to the
Well,
house, or a lot of them. I mean,
Yeah.
we had,
Yeah.
I could name all the names, but it
No,
was
no,
like all the
you're
people
right.
that came
You're
home and
You're
to
right.
parties and whatnot, right? I'd see them at the mission, I'd see them at home,
Sure.
right? And of course I grew up making friends with their kids and that sort of thing. So, so that was kind of just like really growing up in any religion. I don't think that
Right.
experience was really any different than any other religious activity that kids grow up in.
Right.
And in fact, even maybe in a way, even more hands off, because I was doing courses every now and again, but I wasn't going to Sunday service every week and doing Catholic services or being chanted at in Latin or anything like that.
I think that we used words at home that you didn't understand. I think that we did things at home that you didn't understand.
I thought communication was a Scientology word.
I didn't know that.
That was the exact reaction you had
That's kind of
when I
funny.
told her that when I
That's
was,
funny.
I think, 11 or 12 years
Yeah.
old. Because somebody, not a Scientologist, I saw it on TV or I heard it or something, and I said, communication, isn't that a Scientology word? And that was your exact reaction. You were like, no. And I'm like, I've only heard Scientologists ever say that word, so.
Well, the reason I kind of went when you said friends, because I know that you had friends at school, and
Yeah, I did, yeah.
I don't think that you ever got into any kind of hassles, though, about people. I don't think you talked to your friends about Scientology when you were a kid.
No, not a lot. In high school, it kind of came up a couple times, but I was secure in knowing that as little as I knew about it to be able to speak intelligently about it, they knew even less.
Yeah.
So the idea that they were there was a little bit of a social embarrassment about it because it was just something to be laughed at about or made odd for, like anything in high school.
Okay. Yeah.
But it wasn't anything that I ever felt totally, individuated or ostracized for anything.
Okay.
That was never an issue.
We were talking earlier a little bit about this too, and using punishment was not something I enjoyed doing at home. So using ethics
Right.
was
I was
more
going to bring
my
this up. Yes.
cup of tea, and I'm positive that so much of that went right over your head.
Oh my God.
Oh
my God. There were 2 times I remember where you had me do what are called lower conditions, right? Where I had to make up the damage for and make amends for having committed some wrongdoing, right? And one of them was a trip where, just real fast, a trip where we went to a planetarium. And the teacher, we were a whole little group there, and the teacher said something about how back in the primitive times, everybody thought that the Earth was the center of the universe and that the sun went around the Earth. And I just said out of the blue, because I was this kind of kid who did this, well, that was stupid of them, or something like that. And everybody just kind of, I made a scene, right? And I got in trouble, and a note got written. And so, I had to then get through lower conditions on this, right? And I remember just struggling to try to figure out, there's this step where you're supposed to, despite personal danger, make up the damage one has done, going far beyond the normal call of, whatever a person's supposed to do. Would normally do, right? And so I was like just doing my nut. I was like 7 or 8 years old trying to figure out what could I do to make up the damage that I had done to this presenter, and I wrote her this letter and I apologized.
You did.
And then I was gonna like send her my allowance. And my mom is like, what is she gonna do with a quarter,
How's that going to make up for any damage?
What's she going to do with
But
that?
you were trying.
I was trying.
You were.
But I couldn't. But I wasn't really getting through it.
So there were a few things that were a little out gradient for the age that you were. That was pretty age inappropriate.
Yeah.
There really wasn't. But you read a couple of books that were designed for beginners in Scientology or for kids.
There was there were 2 books that were written by a gal named Ruth Minshall, and this was back in the 70s when it was a little looser in the world of Scientology, right? And there were other people still making contributions to the effort, and there were and there were these books that were published about Scientology by Scientologists describing Scientology, right? And it
Under
wasn't
their own name.
Yeah, and it wasn't L. Ron Hubbard,
Right.
right? And one of them was called Miracles for Breakfast, and it was written by
It's
this.
a great little book.
Well, it was, and the reason why is because, it was about Scientology, but it was written by a mother who was basically writing about how she used Scientology in raising her kids.
Yeah.
And the reason why I will sit here to this day and validate her effort on that is because one of the principles that she espoused or took from Scientology and said this could be a positive use of this was honesty is the best policy, right? And she talks in the book about making sure that sitting down and being in good communication with your kids. And if your kids are doing things that they know they shouldn't be doing, they're going around breaking the rules or doing whatever they're doing that they know is not cool, that you provide a safe space for them to be able to tell you that that's happened. So and then you deal with that in a non-judgy way, so that you can move on past that. And I had been taking money from Mom's purse. And I read this book, and I got totally, oh my God, I can't believe I've been doing this, right? I felt so bad. And I went and found you and confessed. And I was crying, and I felt so bad, and you were actually really awesome, because you were like, thank you very much for telling me. I really appreciate that, and we'll take care of it. And we did. And it wasn't this big, huge blame, shame, and regret thing, because I
remember when I was a kid, if I was hiding something from my mom and dad, there was no way that I was ever going to tell them, because I knew it was coming next, because that was the era of punishment versus now we were a little more sophisticated. We were going to use technology and ethics to solve our dilemmas.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually, that really was a good little book.
It was helpful.
It helped me as a mother realize that there were gradients that could be used for kids to accept and understand. And obviously, she was right, because you did that on your own volition. I didn't.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And
Yeah.
I felt like I had a good moral upbringing, or a good moral foundation.
Well, you've got a good moral compass
because of those things.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or at least that those things were there reinforcing. Actually, really, I'd have to say like what you and Dad were putting down. As far as a moral foundation for me. Because that's really where my ideas of right and wrong came from. They didn't come from L. Ron Hubbard. They came from you guys. I just got nudges in the right direction from Ruth Minshall. Later, when I got into Scientology and the real stuff was delivered to me of overts, withholds, overt motivator sequence, and all this kind of stuff, it got much heavier and much more serious, much more intense, and it did become punishment. And that is how Scientology organizationally actually uses that material. So it's, again, kind of a contrast also from what we were talking about earlier of how it's changed, over the years. Because I know parents now, I've talked with people and interviewed people who have used Scientology or have seen Scientology used on kids in a very disciplinary punishment sort of way.
Kind of way.
Yeah. So
it's
just that it was a lighter, fluffier Scientology back then.
After we spoke yesterday, I was thinking about an analogy that just kind of came to me. People are aware of the generation gap. Everybody talks about generation gaps. And in Scientology, that's happened to us in our experiences with Scientology. Granted, they were in different levels of Scientology also, but the analogy is it's kind of like being in Germany before Hitler and then being in Germany after Hitler. And you're in the same organization, you're in the same situation, but it couldn't have been more different.
That's right.
And that's really an analogy that I think is really true of our experiences with it. So although it wasn't all, part party hats and balloons when I was there, because it wasn't all that. You don't lose a whole group of friends overnight and come out being exactly the same. It was totally different than your experience, you know. And for me, the getting into it and getting out of it was not easy. It was problematic, but it was possible. For you to get out of it, to get out of the Sea Org the way that you did, was the difference between night and day, you know. So we had very different experiences at different times in the history of Scientology, and that makes a big difference. And so some of our secrets, some of our understandings of, you know, each other and stuff varied a lot through time.
That's right.
You know?
That's right. Context, I've been learning recently that context has everything to do with how one interprets and accepts information, right? Like the situation that you're in, or how it's presented to a person. Could be, you know, I could have, you know, here's a piece of information, A, B, C, right? And I give it to you in a certain context. I give it to me in a different context.
Right.
We might have totally different ideas about A, B, C as a result of that, right? Context matters. The context that you received Scientology in and that you lived it in, right, was a very different context from the one that I experienced and I lived in, right? And I like to contrast and compare on this because I think it's important. People have this idea in learning about Scientology now, they think it's always been that way. And it hasn't always been the way that it is now. It hasn't. And they look at old timers, right? People from the 80s, 70s, 60s, and they think that they're just a bunch of brainwashed idiots because they speak good things about their experiences with it. And they think, oh, they're just a bunch of fools because they don't know what L. Ron Hubbard was up to. Well, it wasn't, not only did they not know what L. Ron Hubbard wasn't up to, it didn't matter what L. Ron Hubbard was up to. He was thousands of miles away. Nobody cared. You guys were doing Scientology. The context of your Scientology was what was happening in Pasadena.
In that group.
That's right.
In that group of people, with that group of people that were there and the commitment level that we had. You know, the alignment of our ideals and our goals for our lives with any group, whether it's a Catholic church or Scientology or a hospital, we will take the goodness that we have and the goals that we personally want to accomplish and work together with other people to accomplish those things. And there's nothing wrong with that, no matter what the organization is. Now, if you're in a dysfunctional organization, it certainly makes a huge conflict in a person's life. But in Scientology, the goal of let's make the world a better place, how are you going to argue with that? Although the application of it is entirely different from group to group to group, you know? So it just, you're lucky enough to land in the right time in the right group, or things change and you're a little less lucky. But when you got out and you wrote your book, and I'm bragging to my friends about your book, they don't know a lot about my involvement with Scientology because I don't speak about it a lot. There's really no reason to until you got out. And then I was like, well, now I can kind of freely talk about it because there's not going to be any negative ramifications. So people, when I told them about Scientology, they were like, what? You were in a cult? How could you do that? How could you be in a cult? And I was like, I don't have words to tell you. I don't know how to explain that. Back in the day, it really wasn't what it became.
That's right.
You know?
That's right. It did become different. It became at all levels.
Yeah,
you know?
I think so.
I mean, and let's face it. I mean, at this point, you know, you couldn't have the experience now in Scientology that you had.
Right.
Not only because of it's not the 70s anymore. It's because there's hardly any missions anymore.
Exactly.
I mean, that whole thing was wiped out.
And here's the other thing. While we were doing our little mission thing here, Ron was on the ship, probably in a much more cultish environment.
Way.
See what I mean?
Way more.
We were totally removed from that.
As you moved up the line, that's where that
you saw
cult thing
that.
came in.
Yeah.
You know, the Sea Org was
We
completely
didn't,
cultish.
we didn't have that going on.
That wasn't anywhere near you.
No.
You know,
We didn't have that going on.
that's right.
So, you know, naive or gullible or whatever you want to call it. I was open in my life at that time to something new that was going to help me on my spiritual journey in my life. And that seemed like a viable organization that could help me do that. And for as long as it lasted that it did, I was fine with it. And when it didn't, I left. So I feel like I was really lucky that I was involved in it to the degree that I was, because I could leave without it being any, you know, huge
That's right.
thing. There were, I don't want to minimize how affected I was by some of my auditing and some of my experiences later on as a non-staff member. That didn't work so well for me. So there were other things that were negative influences for me about Scientology and reasons that I stayed away from it, you know, ultimately. So I don't want to minimize that, but that was different than my staff involvement.
Yeah.
So, and that's the thing that you and I share in common really about Scientology the most, is I think our involvement with staff and, you know, raising you as a child. But I think, I don't know, I think since the circumstances that we were working under at the time kept it light, you know, unlike maybe some Scientology families. I never, like I said, your dad and I were pretty objective about whatever it is that you were going to do in your future. We just wanted to kind of apply what we were learning and see if it worked at home.
Yeah, I was fortunate because, and I've told people this every time, like all day, every day, that you guys were not overbearing, forcing it on me, you know, sort of thing. And I also recognize that that is unique, or more the exception than the rule with Scientology families. There are, you know, there's books out there, and there's you know, plenty of information out there about Scientology, you know, about kids who were raised in a Scientology or a Sea Org environment, who were just, they were raised in hell.
I mean, and I'm aware of that. I mean, I'm aware that there were awful things.
That's right.
That happened, you know, as time went on.
Exactly, and that's a whole. I didn't want to put this out to counter or oppose those stories. I wanted to put this out to give just more context to the whole picture. Yeah. You know, that wasn't everybody's experience, and that it was just different then. You know, and also another point, I think, totally different point on this, but I think an important one is, because you had that context, you were thinking or applying that to my situation. You know, that was your understanding of what Scientology was. So then years later, I'm going through what I'm going through, and you're thinking, oh, well, this is like what I was doing, when it wasn't at all like what I was doing. You know. So,
you know, it became clearer to me as in my personal life, Scientology became less and less attractive to me for a number of reasons. And the people in Scientology became less attractive to me for a number of reasons. But that became clearer over time, and I was glad that I was not as involved with it. So my only big conflict with that then was you, because I still had a son that, you know, it was like, honestly, Chris, it was like my firstborn I was giving my firstborn to Scientology. It was like, that went through my head more than once. And, you know, it was not a good thing. It wasn't a good feeling. And once that had happened, I had to let it go, because you were doing your thing.
Right.
And that was when I first became a mom, I wasn't going to force you one way or another to do something that I wanted you to do. Or not wanted.
Well, for sure.
You know.
And again, good intentions, right?
Yeah.
And I think what we talked about, you know, already is, it was just, you know, I was being actively lied to in order to get me into a frame of mind where I was going to be wanting so hard to be on staff. The conditions were being misrepresented to me. I was being love bombed, right? In other words, there were people puffing up my ego and puffing up my importance to make me feel like they really liked me and they couldn't wait to have me around, and it wasn't that way.
Right.
And there were deceptive things being done in order to get me on staff. But like we went over, your guys' reaction to that was, everything you could do to make me want to go do it. So it was,
And just now, I'm thinking, why didn't we go down there?
Right.
And just talk to them and say, leave him alone until he's 18. Why didn't we just do that?
Exactly.
We didn't. And I think part of it was we wanted to be seen as good Scientologists,
Right.
and that certainly wouldn't have been seen as being a good Scientologist.
Right.
But we would have gotten away with it.
Yeah. No, in that circumstance, you would have.
Yeah.
And I had to think, because years later, in fact, 15 years later, or so, when I was doing or was around Sea Org recruitment, the thumb screws would be put on parents, like the same kind of situation, where now I was not the direct recruiter, but I was observing recruiters in the Sea Org doing what was done to me, and parents would step up and try to stop it.
And what happened?
And they would be put on the meter. They would be sec checked. They'd be ordered to.
Well, there's the reason.
Ethics and justice. And and it was just it morphed into something heavier.
Like that.
To push even harder to sacrifice their first and second borns to get on staff, right? And into the Sea Org. So so Scientology, has as it's gotten more desperate for more people.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So some of these second gen and third gen Scientologists, it's a desperate situation. Getting these guys on.
There's no doubt in my mind, and I don't want to leave any doubt in anybody else's mind, that I see Scientology today as a cult. It's a destructive cult. If you've watched the conversations we've had, you can see the problem that Scientology causes between people that it has no right to cause.
That's right.
And it should not exist for that reason alone. But there are other reasons. There are a lot of other reasons.
That's right.
The Sea Org and what they did with the kids in the Sea Org, and there's just so many things that I've become aware of over time that we all have become aware of, in spite of the fact that it's closely held secrets. They're not closely held anymore.
That's right.
And now that the human rights abuses are evident, there should be no question at all that we take the same actions here in the United States as they've taken in some of the European countries regarding Scientology.
Yep.
There's no doubt in my mind at all.
Exactly.
It should go away. It should not be allowed to exist. The current climate and culture of that organization has turned toxic, and it should not be allowed.
Exactly.
So
yeah.
I don't want to minimize my feeling about that either.
I'm glad you said that, because somebody might think we're in talking about its kinder, gentler days. Somebody might be wrongly interpreting that to think that we're trying to give it a pass or something.
No.
And that's not the case. Right?
No, it's just that the culture and the application of the more sensible and logical parts of the tech were much more evident in the beginning than what they turned into.
That's exactly. And it also gives a little bit more understanding. Like, if you really get this, if you're really interested in the history of Scientology and why people would get involved in something like this, when you look back at this earlier time periods, you see why it would gain a momentum, or an inertia that would keep it going for decades. Mm-hmm. On strong belief. I mean, people who you had an unfortunate experience in the 80s and left. Mm-hmm. Well, there were some people who got in the 70s, really got into it, didn't have an unfortunate experience in the 80s, so stayed with it, kept staying with it, right? And then it's now morphed into something horrible, and they're kind of stuck. But why that inertia would where that momentum was generated was from that earlier time period. It wasn't. all the, you know, the fervor and the good feeling and all that wasn't particularly generated by people who joined in the 90s and the 2000s.
It was a very
You know.
different. It was a different ballgame.
Yeah, exactly.
You know? So, human beings can create good things and then destroy the thing that they created, and we're kind of known for that. It's a human flaw,
Yep.
but when it's spread organizationally with a lot of money behind it, and people who are greedy,
Yep.
and morph it into something that's bad, then you got to open your eyes and walk away. you know?
Exactly.
So I'm glad that, you know, it's done a lot of damage to people, but it's not damage that can't be overcome with, you know, your own desire to survive. You go into Scientology wanting to survive better. Sometimes we learn our lessons in really weird ways. I was fortunate enough to learn them in ways that were survivable for me, then I could walk away from it. Other people, not so easily. And it really has torn apart families, and it's just heartbreaking with the stories, you know, that families are trying very hard. Half of the family is trying hard to get back together, and the other half is trying, you know, to not be pulled into the organization even farther. So it's just heartbreaking that it does that and that it's allowed to do that. It shouldn't happen. And if they tell you that it's not happening, they're lying.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
anyway.
Well, thank you very much for doing this, Mom.
You're welcome. It's just kind of funny. But you know what? It's been very therapeutic for me. I think it, you know, has taught us a lot about things that we didn't know about each other. And it explains a lot of things to me as to how I could have, from your viewpoint, knowing what you knew, been more effective, you know.
Yeah.
And so if that helps anybody else, that's fine.
And that's the whole, I really hope
Yeah.
it does.
Yeah.
I really hope it does. I hope that our story can help, you know, anybody out there
Right.
who needs some help, you know, with situations we've lived through,
Exactly.
you know.
And
So,
and the other thing is, read the books, get your own certainty on it, know why you're doing what you're doing, and that relationship between you and that person, it is the most important part. It's not whether they've made a good or a bad choice even. It's just maintain that relationship and be patient until the picture turns. Because in our situation it did. I think it will for a lot of other people too.
I agree completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Okay.
right, that's it. Thank you.
Bye-bye.